Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So this week we're talking about storytelling. Now, I'm sure you all know someone who's an amazing storyteller. It might be a friend, a family member, a work colleague, and they're able just to take an average everyday situation and turn it into an amazing story. But have you ever wished you could do that yourself? Well, the good news is that storytelling is a skill that can and should be learnt. And I used to be absolutely rubbish at telling stories, but after a lot of practice and now being a professional magician where it's pretty much my job to tell stories, I've got to a level where I'm pretty good at it. So what I'm going to be doing in this video is giving you my top 7 tips on how to become an amazing storyteller. So let's get into it. So tip number 1 is understanding the importance of storytelling. So storytelling is one of those weird things that we all do, but no one's ever actually taught us how to tell a really good story. And a stat came out recently that says 65% of all the words that come out your mouth are either stories or gossip. So it doesn't matter what happens in your life, you're going to constantly be telling stories to people. Now, storytelling can benefit all aspects of your life. Just think about the last time you're at a dinner party or something. The people who are good at telling stories naturally just are able to captivate the room and draw people into them. And they're able to just take an average everyday situation and make it really interesting. And you've probably also seen people at dinner parties who might be really interesting, they might be really knowledgeable, but they're not able to convey that information in a way that's captivating, and therefore whatever they say just kind of falls flat. So the point here is whatever aspect of your life you're trying to improve, storytelling can really help with that, but it's really a skill that we're never taught how to do. So I want to tell you about how I got better at storytelling, and then I'm going to give you some practical tips on what you can do to become a better storyteller. So tip number 2 is to realize that anyone can become a good storyteller. So my background with storytelling is that I just used to be really bad at it. Genuinely, I was absolutely awful at telling stories. And the moment I realized this was when I went on a camping trip with a friend of mine. Now, this friend, he was very charismatic and naturally just very good at telling stories. And we went on the camping trip, we had a great time out there, and then we came back. And upon arriving home, obviously we told our friends and family what we got up to. And when he told them about our experiences camping, they were laughing and they just had showed so much interest in everything he said. But then when I sort of told them about what I got up to when camping with him, the response was just very different. It wasn't that they weren't interested, it's just they didn't react in the same way, and the things I said just kind of fell flat. So we both had exactly the same experience, but the way we talked about that experience produced completely different results to the people we talked to. People who listened to him thought we were the most amazing time in the world, and people who listened to me just were like, whatever. And it was at that moment I realized that, okay, I need to get better at storytelling and actually improve how I convey the kind of things that I say to people, so they will find the kind of things that I'm talking about more interesting and all that kind of stuff. So for me, that's when the penny really dropped. And then from there, I started researching it and looking into how to tell better stories. And the first big thing that I realized was that you need a mindset shift on what a story actually is. So you don't want to be thinking of a story as just a bunch of words you say to someone to try and get them interested in something. Instead, every single story is broken down into 4 main parts. There's the hook, then there's the context, then there's the main story itself, and finally there's the ending. And what separates a good storyteller from a bad storyteller is how good they are at talking about each of these 4 components. So a good storyteller will excel at talking about the hook, context, main story, and ending, and a bad storyteller won't. So what we're going to do now is break down each of these 4 things so you can learn how to actually become a better storyteller yourself. So tip number 3 is to start off with a hook. So a hook is basically just the thing you say at the beginning of a story to really captivate people and bring them in. I want to show you a really good example of a hook, so quickly watch this video here.
A little over 20 years ago, I did something that I regret. Something that I'm not particularly proud of. Something that in many ways I wish no one would ever know.
And isn't that amazing? You can see straight away how he's hooked you in and you immediately want to know what he's regretted. So it should be quite clear now what a hook is. It's just a sentence you say to make people go, wow, keep going, I want to find out what you're going to be talking about. So let me give you a really basic example. I've got a poker chip here, and let's just say I was going to do a magic trick with it, so I take the chip and it's gone. Now that's an okay-ish trick, but if I start it off by saying to the audience, have you ever seen something vanish? And they go, no. And then you go, well, look at this chip here. And then you continue and do the vanish and all that kind of stuff. But as soon as you introduce a hook to whatever you're doing, the story you're telling, it instantly becomes much more grabbing. So what I want you to do now is think of a story that you tell people all the time, and then think of a way to introduce that story in just a single sentence that will grab people's attention. It could be something that produces an emotion of curiosity. It could be something shocking. It could be something intriguing, just something that makes people want to listen to the rest of what you've got to say. So tip number 4 is to add context to your story. This is something I've noticed that people surprisingly forget to do. Like, how many times have you been listening to someone talking about something and you're nodding along and you just have absolutely no idea what they're going on about? And I think this happens all the time. And the reason for this is context. You don't have the context that they have, so you don't really know what their story's about. In fact, there's an incredible book, one of my favorite books, called Storyworthy by Matthew Dix. And in that, he says, context is everything. It's what gives your story meaning. It's what makes your story relatable. So what you need to do with context is set the scene, introduce the characters, and produce some sort of backstory. So if we go back to the poker chip example, instead of just introducing it by saying, have you ever seen a poker chip vanish? You could then take it further and say something like, well, this is a poker chip here that my grandfather actually found in the 1950s when he was backpacking across Europe. And there was an incredible thing with this poker chip because blah, 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 you can make it vanish. So do you see by how adding context to a story, you can suddenly make it intriguing and people just want to listen? The big problem I see is people just launch straight into their stories. They launch into the main part of everything and they forget about the hook and they forget about the context. So again, but next time you're telling a story, really think about the hook and context before you actually get into the real meat of it. So tip number 5 is to then work on your main story. Now, this is actually usually the bit that people are best best at when telling the stories, because it's the part that you normally actually just launch straight into and forget about the hook and the context and that kind of stuff. But essentially the main story is just something that introduces the plot line, the conflicts and the challenges that whatever your story is about involves. And the key to having a really good main story is to bring out the details. So really good storytellers are able to bring out details that provoke emotions in the people who are listening to the story. So a 2007 study showed that when you have detailed descriptions of a setting, characters or actions, listeners are more likely to remember the information and to feel more immersed in the story. So the real key here is to show and don't tell. You really want to use visual imagery that provokes emotions in the people listening to your story, so they really feel like they're there and they can relate to it. So let's just say you were talking about a story and you wanted to say that you were scared. Instead of just going, yes, this happened and I was really scared, you want to say something like, I could feel the goosebumps all along my arm, the brow on my forehead was dripping with sweat, and my hair was standing on end, and my heart was beating right out of my chest because da-da-da-da-da-da. So what you're trying to do here is really show the audience what's going on, not just tell them what's going on. And this allows them to relate to the visual imagery much more, and therefore they're going to be much more invested in whatever story you're telling. So the more descriptive it is and the more visual it is, the better it's going to be, and it's going to be a more engaging story. So tip number 6 is to have a strong ending to your story. So a good ending will actually satisfy the audience and really reinforce the message behind your story, whilst a bad ending can actually undermine an otherwise great story. And the best way to create a strong ending to your story is to answer the question, so what? What is the point of everything you just said? Because what bad stories do is just say what happened. These are the events and this is what happened. But what the so what question does is it takes it to the next level and basically gives your story a purpose and a takeaway that the listeners can then use. So your so what could be a lesson that you learned, some emotions that were brought up that really changed how you thought about something, a feeling that you experienced that you never want to experience again. Like, let's just use the example of the poker chip stuff. Maybe it's a story about you gambling and you lost all your money, and because of that you never want to ever step foot in a casino ever again. That's the so what thing, because you've learned that gambling is really bad for you. Whilst this does sound simple, a lot of people forget about this and they just don't give the story any purpose. So next time you're telling a story, think about the so what question, as it gives your story meaning, which overall makes it more impactful and memorable. Tip number 7 is to practice telling your stories. Now this is probably actually the most important part of the entire video, and as Matthew Dickey says, the best way to become a better storyteller is to practice your stories out loud. There's no other way to do it. Now when doing magic, this is something that I do all the time. So as I've said, when I'm doing a trick, 80% of my magic trick is presentation, stories, cracking jokes, getting on with the audience, and 20% is the actual trick itself. So when I'm telling a story, it's all rehearsed and I've written everything down. So I literally will get a piece of paper, I'll think of the magic trick that I'm doing, but in your case, it might just be a story or an experience that you've had. And I recommend you write it down, all the key parts, and then you practice telling that story over and over again in the mirror, in the shower, whilst driving to work, anywhere you can. Just tell the story to yourself, because it means when it comes time to deliver that story, you know what you're going to say, you know when you're going to say it, so you can deliver it with confidence. Anyway, there's 7 tips on how to become a better storyteller, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.